Okay, so we've mapped Singer's basic argument, and all of this comes from essentially the first page using the pagination of the hard copy I gave you in class. Page 1 to like the top of page 2. There's a lot of paper left, so where is the rest of the paper in connection to this argument map we've got so far? Well, as we discussed in class, the remainder of the paper is really focused on arguing for this principle. The other ones are fairly straightforward. So this is a value claim. Suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. That's a value claim. And as you may recall, let's look at the actual text here. He says, I begin with the assumption that, and he says, I shall not argue for this view. And that if you don't accept this, then feel free to just disregard the rest of the argument because it all requires that you accept this. And he thinks you will. So no more on this in the rest of the paper. And the other two are pretty straightforward. Not necessarily such that you could never argue against them, but they're pretty straightforward. Is it within our power? Well, what would it take to solve this kind of issue, and what would it take to do it? Like, is it something if we shifted our values / how we use our money / what? Is it something we could, in theory, do, and what would it take? That's a question. And even if it's not, is it in our power to solve the whole thing? Can we prevent some, right? So this seems pretty straightforward. And can we do it without thereby sacrificing anything morally significant? Well, this is something that we might examine as well, but Singer suggests, or at least we'll see if there's anything in the paper that actually supports this. But the main point here is that this is the tough one. He begins his sort of examination of this principle by noting that it kind of seems uncontroversial and fairly acceptable, but it's actually pretty deceptive in that if we spell out the implications of this principle, it turns out that we don't live by it. And it would be difficult to change our habits, our lives, our culture such that we do. And he's suggesting that we're doing something wrong when we don't. So it turns out that this is a pretty significant claim to make, and the majority of the paper is about this claim. Side note, before we talk about how to argue for a principle, or in this case, how Singer goes about arguing for this principle, it's worth noting that you can adjust your node. So you can play with the node style. Say I want to highlight that this one is super important, and I'm going to make it, I don't know what color suggests important, green. Now I've made my node green, and if you think like, oh, that's really ugly, you can use the default and change the text color. Something you could do to signify that this is really important if you want to. Another thing you can do is attach photos to your node. You can attach files to it if you wanted to associate things with nodes. As you are mapping your own papers, these might be things you want to do in addition to nodes, which we've already looked at. So our question now is, how do you even argue for a moral principle? That's a question I want you to consider over the next couple of weeks. And in thinking about that question, let's focus on, how does Singer argue for a moral principle? What is his argumentative strategy? I want to table these questions for a moment, and instead, let's just ask about principles generally. What are some principles that you or we, people in general, live by, in particular moral principles? Take a minute and think about it. Maybe pause the video and come up with a set of principles that you find compelling that you would organize your own life around. Here's a super simple one. You shouldn't harm others. Do no harm. Now, this principle doesn't need to be some exceptionless cornerstone that can never be violated in any context whatsoever in order to be helpful. But in order for principles to be of any use to us, we need to be able to apply them to concrete cases and see if they guide us, right? So imagine a concrete case. Imagine that you're a physician and a patient is ill and needs a life-saving procedure. What should you do? And one of the principles you live by is you shouldn't harm others. Does that mean that you shouldn't, let's say, they need their leg removed because they have gangrene and that's a life-saving procedure, or they need to have chemotherapy because they have cancer and that's a life-saving procedure? These are very painful and difficult procedures for a person to go through. Would it be considered harming somebody in order to save their lives? Well, you might think, oh, we need to qualify the principle. So in general, you shouldn't harm others, but there are interesting qualifications in this kind of case. What are the qualifications we'd make to this principle so that it would apply to this case? Pause the video and maybe think about it a second. Perhaps the most general thing we could say is you shouldn't harm others unless you've got a good reason, right? Unless you're justified in doing so. And then we could spell out saving a person's life is a really important thing. Acting to save one's life even is a good reason to harm them, something like that. Now, something so basic as this might be enough to capture why it isn't a problem for physicians to physically harm their patients in order to save their lives. And you could spell this out further, like the amount of harm done by the procedure compared to the amount of good done by saving them. Well, there are ways to get more specific. We're keeping it general here. Now let's imagine we change the case a bit. But what if the patient doesn't want the procedure in such a case? Well, according to this principle, you might still have a good reason. You shouldn't harm others unless you have a good reason. You still have the reason of saving their life, even though they don't want to go through the procedure in order to save their life. So now what should we do? Does this principle guide us here? What do we learn about this principle? Is there an exception such that we should modify the principle? This raises interesting questions. It gets even more difficult when it's not the patient who doesn't want the procedure, but the parent of a patient who doesn't want the procedure, right? And so figuring out which principles apply, when there are exceptions and when there are not, when we should qualify the principle, how we should qualify it, these are all interesting questions to consider. One way we do it is by applying the principle to cases and then imagining or just trying to creatively come up with interesting qualifications and see how those would apply to the case at hand, and in general, if they can be argued for as exceptions to the rule or not. So we're doing something kind of like this in arguing for Singer's principle. Let's consider a similar but different principle to Peter Singer's actual one. So imagine instead he had started with this principle. Imagine, it shouldn't start with you, imagine that the principle is, if people are suffering and dying from lack of food, shelter, and medical care, then you ought to act to prevent it. Say that is the principle. And we can apply that to the Bangladesh case or the Bengal case. People are dying from a lack of food, shelter, and medical care. It follows then that you ought to act to prevent it. Now, one thing you might say is, well, what about the person who has no money at all and no resources whatsoever? What should they do? Well, that is an important case where, like, well, we should qualify this, assuming it's in your power to do it. So this one doesn't make that qualification that you ought to act if you can, right? This one just says, if people are suffering and dying, and they are, then you ought to do something. And this one says, if it's in your power to do something, you should. So this one is already a qualified version of this. This one would be harder to argue for because it would suggest that a lot of people ought to be doing something even though they can't. And there's a moral principle that is often thought to be a good one. And that's the claim that ought implies can. If you ought to do something, it must be the case that you can do that thing. If I say you morally ought to jump over the moon, it would be wrong for you not to do that. And you were to say, I can't jump over the moon, that's not a thing I can do. I say, well, you've just done something morally wrong. It seems weird to think that you can do something morally wrong even though you had zero ability to do otherwise. So since this principle would violate this common sense idea that in order to be required to do something, you have to actually be able to do that thing, we can qualify it so that it says, if it's in your power. So this is already a qualified version of some other kind of more general one. Here's another principle that could be used to get to our conclusion. If it is in our power to prevent something very bad from happening, then we ought to do that thing. And this leaves it open to objections. Well, what if you have to kill someone in order to do that? So imagine that the only way, imagine you're at something like the Musgrove Conference, and the only way that you can get someone to agree to send aid and thereby save a lot of lives is to murder a political opponent or something like that. That seems to be acceptable according to this principle. If it's in your power to do that thing, then you ought to do it. Whereas this makes an important qualification, without sacrificing anything morally significant, which Singer explicitly elaborates to include doing something morally wrong. So this one just says, if you can make it happen, you should. And this one says, if you can make it happen without doing anything wrong or failing to do something good or giving up anything that is morally comparable / significant, then you ought to do it. So it's already qualified there. So this is already a qualified principle. That's the moral of the story here. And it seems generally like, at least on the face of it, fairly acceptable. But as we'll soon see, it is fairly strong. It implies that we actually ought to be doing quite a lot all the time. And so if there are objections to this principle, it might be just like the other ones that, well, this means that something counterintuitive is the case. Maybe we ought to qualify it again. And so maybe the fact that other people are in a position to help and are not doing so, maybe that helps us to think about how we could qualify this principle. Should we qualify it further so that it says something like, if it is in our power to prevent something very bad from happening without sacrificing anything morally significant, and we are the only one in a position to help, then we ought morally to do it. Is that an alternative to this that we should argue for? And Singer, of course, is going to argue against this, and other such ones. So you might look at understanding many of the objections as either suggesting qualifications of this principle or suggesting alternative principles. So here's another qualification. Perhaps it even starts to count as a new principle, I'm not sure. How about this? If it is in our power to prevent something very bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything morally significant, we ought, morally speaking, to do what our fair share would be if everyone in a position to help were to act. That's a different principle, right? So our goal here is to examine which principle actually applies to the situation and which principle can be defended in general by imagining potential exceptions and considering various qualifications. I hope that helps to sort of understand the structure of Singer's actual argument.